Audio Unleashed.
Can we go ahead and say this is the Audio Unleashed podcast?
We can say this is the Audio Unleashed podcast, and you're Brent.
And you're Dennis.
That's true.
And the fun has officially started.
Yeah, let's get to it, man.
So what are we going to talk about?
We got a big old episode this week, but I think we're going to start, normally here with Audio Unleashed, we will find an article that someone has written or a video that someone has done, and we will respond to that. And we will use that as sort of a vehicle to illuminate aspects of audio reproduction that we want to talk about. But yeah, we've got a lot of feedback lately from listeners to the podcast. And so I thought it'd be a cool place to start with just sort of an extended mailbag, sort of talk about some of the feedback we've gotten from the last episode and clarify some points, dig into some others, and let's make a whole segment of it. What do you think?
It's good to clarify. It's good to clarify our positions, because normally we're just cracking jokes and we let people kind of figure out what our positions are, because we don't just come out and say it.
Yeah.
But this time we'll come out and say exactly what our positions are on things, make it crystal clear, so then other people can jump on YouTube and trash us for those statements.
Still going to misconstrue.
They'll misstate what we said and then trash us for their own misstatements that aren't what we said.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Where do you want to go from there, buddy?
Our second segment's going to be a very special second segment, because we have a guest on, which we don't do a lot, but there was a really awesome article. The article is Sphere of Influence, and it's about Dr. Sean Olive's work in the Harman curve and all that stuff. And it's actually on the Crutchfield website. Crutchfield being a major online vendor of audio gear. Normally you think, okay, it's appearing on the audio store's website. You don't expect it to be much. This is a world-class article. It's very, very good. It's as good as anything you read on CNET or, Digital Trends or any of the sites that cover a lot of audio. It's a really, really good article, and it goes deep, but it gets into criticisms of the Harman curve. And so we thought we would have Lauren on to kind of address that, because Lauren's tested possibly more headphones than anybody. She's nearing 2,000, and she uses outside listeners, and she actually gets tons of reader feedback and all that kind of thing that most reviewers are isolated from.
Right.
So we thought her opinions and statements on this would be really relevant, because then also she's got about 10 years of experience in doing this. She is the headphone editor for Wirecutter, which is a big New York Times owned website, which I also work for and which you freelance for. So her experience and the amount of feedback she's getting are a lot broader and I think probably more relevant than the feedback that a typical audiophile reviewer is getting, who's only being read by a small number of audiophiles.
Yeah.
And we have a third segment.
We do. This is one that you sent to me. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit behind listening to Darko's podcast, but you sent me a link to the newest episode, I believe, podcast episode number 52, Percentage THD. Why is it misleading? And for any of our normie listeners who don't know what we're talking about, I think most people have probably heard of THD, Total Harmonic Distortion, which is always expressed as a percentage. So in other words, the signal has 0.01% total harmonic distortion at this output level across the frequency band. So this is an episode that he did with Sir John,
just like Sir John.
Sir John. And his last name?
I give up. Eben, I think.
Okay. So he joined John for this episode. And anyway, they had a lot to say about THD. And so we're going to talk about that and probably, give some examples of some reasons why maybe we have different attitudes on this. So in some respects,
I'm just going to say, I think he had some really insightful things to say. And then he had a lot of things to say that were not insightful, that seemed to be more parroting the marketing spin of manufacturers than actual understanding of distortion. But we're going to go into a deep dive on distortion, but we're going to keep it, like accessible, because I've written a lot about this topic, and I have measurement gear, and I can look and see that I can hear the distortion. I can see it. I'm among the top, Bluetooth speaker reviewers. And boy, if you want to hear distortion, Bluetooth speakers are your path to glory.
Yeah. So what are we doing for patrons this week?
I was shocked, not entirely shocked. I don't think anybody in the audio industry was that surprised, because we've seen this happen so many times before. An article from strategy.com, one of the best, sort of audio trade industry, websites out there. Masimo board authorizes management to prepare a spinoff of consumer unit. And Masimo is the company that makes mostly health-related products that purchased Sound United. And Sound United was the company that owned Definitive Technology, Polk, Boston Acoustics, Bowers & Wilkins. I said it right that time.
Yeah.
Class A Audio, Marantz, Denon. Masimo bought them, I think, a few years ago, hoping for some synergy between the consumer audio side and the more health-related products that Masimo focuses on. But I guess they did not achieve that synergy. And we're going to go into like a more tradey kind of deep dive on that and talk about some of the industry trends that are happening that Ted Green, the guy who does strategy, was mentioning, and dig in a little bit.
But first, I have to say, man, I'm gonna kick off the first segment.
Okay.
Our reader mailbag with what is, I believe, my favorite comment we've ever received. And apologies to everyone else who's commented. We love all of your. No. We love most of your comments, but this one in particular really, really made me smile. This is somebody came on YouTube and left us a comment on the last episode. This is a username True Stereo. His handle is True Stereo 1323. But this is a comment. This made my day. Thanks for the podcast. It's a refreshing change from other audio media. Unleashed, but not unhinged. And I gotta say, nice, buddy, if we ever do t-shirts, that's what they've got to say. Unleashed, but not unhinged. I love that.
Yeah.
That's our new slogan, I think.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was insightful. We're not unhinged. We're just unleashed.
Just unleashed.
But our unleashedness allows us to criticize the unhinged people we believe to be unhinged, because they are.
Yeah. but before we get to them, let's talk about, we got a comment on our Patreon page from a patron named Mark Flock, which I think a lot of people who are on Facebook might recognize Mark Block for his association with the Audiophile Society. So, this is a guy he's also friends with Steve Guttenberg. So this is a guy that's maybe you've got to be hardcore into this to really know his name, but a lot of people who are in this industry know Mark's name and really like Mark. He's a really cool guy. So he left a comment on our Patreon page about the whole Fuse situation, and it's a long one. Do you want to get into that comment and sort of respond to it? What were the key takeaways from that you took?
So he actually, we were kind of treating fuses, I was certainly, as something that's as invariant as a piece of wire. And he wrote into, and I apologize, Mark, if we're paraphrasing you incorrectly here, but he wrote in to point out that, actually there are some variations in fuse performance that could conceivably make a difference in audio. And he actually quotes a favorite book of mine, which is Designing Audio Power Amplifiers by Bob Cordell, which is, this is my favorite because he actually gets into Class D, and that's where I learned
the first gift you ever bought me, like 20 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, the first Christmas gift you ever got me. So
I think probably every gift I've ever gotten you was a book about audio, probably. So, but he points out that, fuses can have a higher impedance when they get hot. I didn't know that. And although the difference occurs, see, this is what worries me, is like you tell, people that buy into the idea of fuses, like our good friends at the Absolute Sound. You tell them that and they're like, oh, see, fuses make a difference. And I'm thankful for Mark for pointing this out, but you have to analyze this and go like, okay, wait a minute. So they're going from, the cold fuse was 78 milliohms, whereas you put a few amps through it, it's 113 milliohms.
Right.
Now, you may recall, I measured the input impedance, in other words, the impedance of the transformer in one of my Outlaw amps at 400 and something ohms, right?
Yeah.
So, and the typical impedance of a speaker cable might be, some tiny fraction of an ohm. And I think we kind of figured that the impedance of a fuse might be roughly equivalent to that of the impedance of maybe a 6 or 8 foot speaker cable, a good 6 or 8 foot speaker cable, but it's still insignificant in terms of the total impedance of the system. So, in other words, when you've got 400 ohms worth of transformer hanging there, 0.01 to 0.04 ohms
yeah,
going into it, doesn't make any difference, right?
It's the thing that he links says, this represents a 45% increase in fuse resistance. And those sorts of statistics can often be misleading. I remember when I was first getting into genetic analysis of my own genome, I saw this one S&P that the program that I was using said, the presence of this S&P represents some like a 12-fold increase in your risk of this disease. And I'm like, oh, crap, man, a 12-fold increase? That's crazy. And then it was like, you dig deeper and it's like, yeah, it increases your risk from 0.04% to 0.48%. It's like, yeah, I'm not worried about that.
So anyway, he's saying, but the thing that Mark linked to, the quote that Mark pasted here in Facebook is saying, at 20 hertz, amplifier distortion due to the fuse is calculated to be 0.0033%.
Right.
And, audible distortion in electronics is, it's going to depend on the frequency, et cetera. And we'll be discussing this more later.
Yeah, we should talk about that.
But a good baseline for audible distortion in audio electronics is about 0.5%. I learned that from Bob Carver.
Nice.
And I test a lot of things that distort, because a lot of times you push things to to and past their distortion limit when you test them. So I know what distortion sounds like. And that's somewhere. So this is not, 003 is not an audible level of distortion. And there's also another article, I think that he linked to, that was from a headphone and speaker design book. And I was really worried that some audiophiles might glom onto this thing and be like, here's more, or manufacturers would glom onto it thinking, here's more proof that fuses matter. And this was actually from a speaker design book. It was talking about speaker fuses, like inside the speaker, which I've taken a lot of speakers apart. I can't ever remember seeing one, but I remember seeing a few speakers that had like a replaceable fuse or something. But, people would put like a fuse on the tweeter to keep it from blowing, right?
Right.
And that particular article went into the impedance differences with fuses, how it's, something like, pretty close to where the fuse would blow.
Right.
The impedance goes up by like a factor of 4 or something.
Right.
At like low frequencies, at 20 hertz, the impedance goes up by a factor of 4 or something like that.
One key thing to point out also is that this is talking about fuses that are actually in the signal path. Whereas
in the signal
last
path,
episode, we were talking about fuses that were not in the signal path.
Right.
So,
right. The problem with that is that, okay, that's great if you have a fuse in your speaker. Maybe you do. Yeah. But it's with any of these audio products, if there's a fuse in the AC line, that fuse is always going to be looking at 60 hertz, American, and 50 hertz European, and then whatever. And then I should also say, if you've ever, I think anybody who's measured amps for very long has run a voltmeter on their power line to see what happens when you start running the amp and start pushing the amp to its limits. And with some big amps, you'll actually see your power line start to sag. And also in depending on a lot of things, you'll also see your power line start to sag during the day when demand is high and then go back up.
Yeah.
When demand is not, especially like, let's say in the South, let's say you're in Houston, Texas, my hometown, where people are running the air conditioner like crazy in the summer, once nighttime hits, the the voltage is probably going to go up quite a bit. Maybe from 100 and the 110, 112 up to 118 or something like that. So voltage, little variations in your AC line are common, and they're not significant. Some people say their systems sound better at night, but I don't know that we have any actual evidence to that effect. Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, so minor little variations in your AC that could be caused by a fuse heating up are insignificant.
The articles were interesting, though. I thank Mark for sending them, because I learned some stuff I did not know. So thank you very much for that, Mark. Yeah.
But our official position remains that Michael Firmer is off his rocker.
That's the least controversial thing you've ever said.
Okay.
Oh boy, we did bring some TAS fanboys out of the woodworks, though. Do we want to talk about this comment from Paul Rickard?
Yeah, on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, and Paul may be a really, really nice guy. He may be a delight, but I'm frustrated with Paul because he's very much misrepresenting our position, and I always find that to be frustrating, because it's not a good place from which to begin an honest conversation, Right. I mean, you said in the last episode that you knew of no scientific study in which people could differentiate between two amps. You said that you have listened to amps and done ABX testing. And here's the key thing. You said, yeah, I could hear a difference, but then I would go try to identify whether X was A or B, and I could not, better than a coin flip.
Exactly.
Well, Paul is saying, well, you're saying you couldn't hear a difference? Why are you even in this job? Like, why are you even reviewers if you don't think that's true? And to me, that would be like saying, well, if you think corruption is bad, then why do you write about politics? I mean, anyway, I wanted to get that out of the way, because I imagine when you let loose here, you're not going to stop. So go ahead, rant on, buddy.
The thing that most upset me here, and I kind of just brushed him off because I got sick of dealing with it. But I'm citing scientific studies. I'm like, hey, I said I don't know of anyone being able to, differentiate between two normally functioning amplifiers in a scientific study. And, I'm an AES member. I pay $125 a year for that privilege and that honor. And, that means I can go on there and find all these papers whenever I want. That's why I'm an AES member, right? And he responds, I haven't read the studies, but my personal belief is that it is more likely they were poorly designed than it was I was suffering from delusions, blah, 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 which we'll get to that in a second. But this really upsets me when someone who is not a scientist, is not an audio engineer, is not actively involved in this field. And I went and looked at his Facebook page. He's not. But I've heard this from a lot of audiophiles before. It's like, well, this scientific study must be wrong. It must be poorly designed. Okay. And this is an insult to me, because some of this work is my own, right? I'm saying, hey, I got an ABX box and I can't hear the difference. Well, what about my study is poorly designed? Is there a flaw in the design of the ABX box? Well, you don't know, because you don't have, this guy doesn't have one. Is there a flaw in my methodology because I hooked up two amps and level matched them and couldn't hear a difference? All the people that have done these studies over the years, is there a flaw in their methodology? Well, what was it? I've heard this for decades. It's like, well, if the scientific study doesn't agree with my beliefs, then it must be poorly designed. And that's and it always comes from people who don't do science. And the people that work their asses off doing science are the ones being criticized, like, with never, ever, ever specific criticisms. I've heard so many things of like, well, ABX, boxes are all, wrong, and they change the signal, and it's like, how do you know this? You don't have one. You've never encountered one. You don't possess the chops to do, circuit analysis. You don't possess any measurement gear. You're just saying it's poorly designed or whatever because it doesn't agree with your impression. And this really upsets me because you know what? Look, I've been doing this professionally since 1989.
Yeah.
And I would argue to a much, much, much more serious degree than 99% of my peers, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I've spent tens of thousands of bucks on measurement gear, you know. I mean, I've done blind testing for 30 years, starting at Video Magazine in the early 90s, right?
Yeah.
And very few people have that level of seriousness. And to have someone say, well, you know, my work is poorly designed, it's like, well,
right.
But now I want to say, though, I've been where this guy was before.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he carefully did A/B comparisons of over 12 amps, which I guess means 13, 8 DACs and 7 preamps in the last 4 years, except carefully did A/B comparisons. What does that mean? If you're me, I can explain exactly how I did my level matching. I will tell you how close we got the level matching. And I tell you what I did to match, how I matched the levels, right? I tell you what outboard gear I used, if any. I tell you everything about what I did. I don't say carefully, okay? I say, here's how I did it. That means something. Saying I carefully did this, well, you know, I can say I carefully did anything. Right?
Yeah.
So I kind of always held the view like, okay, there are little differences among amplifiers, and sometimes it amounts to something, and a lot of times it doesn't. But then when I got my ABX box, I think as we talked about in the last episode, I assumed, well, I've heard differences among amplifiers. I know I'll be able to nail an ABX test, and I never was able to.
Well, but you let me point out, though, that when we were talking about that, you did say, even when you're running through the ABX, you're listening and you're like, oh, yeah, I can hear a difference between these. And then you have to choose, okay, is X A or B? And that's when you fail. Like, you heard differences, but you couldn't do it reliably. You could not replicate it. It was no better than chance. And so this guy's saying, you didn't answer my question about whether you personally heard all amps as being the same. You did. You answered that question in that episode. You know, if the amp is operating the way it ought to operate with your speakers, then I honestly think you're going to hear more difference between two volume controls than you will two amps. So like there are things, but if there were a scientific study that said, no, that's not the case, I would be like, all right, well, I would be interested in understanding why I thought that, but I have to dismiss that now because it's been demonstrated that it's not true, you know?
Okay, that would be a great segue to our next segment. If our next segment was going to be our third segment, but it's actually going to be our second segment with Lauren Dragan from Wirecutter coming right up.
Let's do it.
And we're back. This is Audio
Unleashed.
Special segment.
Ooh. Who's that? Who's that just appeared on our podcast?
Hi, I'm Lauren Dragan. I am a primarily headphone reviewer. I write for Wirecutter and have written for a whole bunch of other magazines before I showed up at Wirecutter. And probably sometime later this year, I will have tested my 2000th pair of headphones for Wirecutter.
So the reason that we wanted to have you on is because I found a really great article by a guy named Jeff Miller, who works for works for Crutchfield. But it's a big article. It's called Sphere of Influence, How Harman and Dr. Sean Olive Are Reshaping Headphone Sound. And he visited Harman's research facilities and went really in depth and actually had a really frank discussion about Harman curve, which is the sort of preferred tuning curve that Harman research has come up with and that we've been talking about for about, 10 years now. And we wanted to have you on because you have probably tested more headphones than anybody in the last 10 years.
Maybe. Yeah.
What Jeff does here is he actually talks about, the controversy, and he allows Sean to answer it. And it's a really awesome conversation, I thought. But it basically kind of leaves open the question of this, how valid is it to have a target curve for headphones? And I know that you have tested, you're up to almost 2,000 headphones. You've tested a whole ton that we know to be tuned to Harman curve. And I just wonder, and you also use other listeners, which almost no other reviewers do. And I just wanted to get your impression of what do you think about Harman curve?
First of all, and I know, we've all probably talked about this at some point at a, dinner table somewhere, but Harman curve is the only thing that has actual research behind it. If we're talking over-ear headphones, in-ears, you got Knowles. But, they've actually done work on it. So until someone else can fund a study that's of the same scope and level of testing, then that's the evidence we have to go with right now. And, I think when they talk about the Harman curve, it's sort of preference, so to speak, it does get more than half of people being, on the same page, which is honestly remarkable in any sort of demographic. When you think about it, there are very few things that more than half the people agree upon. So that in itself is, noteworthy. And it is, I think, more of an argument for headphones that are, wired and can't be tuned individually. I feel as though it's becoming less and less of a necessity, especially with things like, the way the wireless headphones are now, Bluetooth earbuds especially. There are so many apps that have really solid EQing abilities inside there. So, you can really dial in exactly the sound that you prefer. But when we are talking about a starting place for something that is the baseline of where we're going to deviate from, it's nice to start from a place that people are familiar and people mostly find pleasant, and that's kind of where I have to do my reviewing. Is a lot of times there's stuff that I think will be great for other people that isn't necessarily my thing that I like. And I try to test for those other individualized needs and have those recommendations available. But ultimately, if I get it wrong, if I put up something that most people don't like when they buy, we're going to get a ton of comments in the comments section. I'm going to get a lot of returns and, bad reviews in, Amazon or other places where people purchase them. And my editors are going to come for me because they're going to say, oh, well, we're noticing that people are not buying this anymore. We're noticing that they're picking something else. And why is that? And so if that happens, I look into it. But, I've gotten to the point now after doing this for so long that I've kind of dialed it in where my job is to make sure when somebody gets something that they enjoy it. And that's really the most simple part of it. And it's so, if you want to obsess over something and find it to be your own personal thing, that there's nothing wrong with that. But then it also says, you can't be just like these folks that are arguing that Harman curve is wrong. You are, because they say, well, you can't be prescriptive to everyone by saying Harman curve is right. You can't do the reverse either. You can't say Harman curve is wrong because you like something else. It doesn't negate it. Both can be true.
Well, you can say it. And it's often, and many reviewers do say that. But I want to point out, though, that you have the mission of most reviewers. I mean, a lot of them like to think that, they are trying to guide people through buying decisions. However, they don't get in any kind of trouble if they might have a couple of readers that get on the comments section or trash them on Reddit or something like that. But, you actually, as a Wirecutter writer, and we all write for Wirecutter to one degree or another, you actually look really bad to your superiors if you're picking products that the readers hate. I think one interesting thing to point out, though, is that for, how long has the Sony 7506 been like your budget audiophile headphone pick?
That was actually the very first headphone pick I made. So 10 years ago, at least 10, 11 years.
And the Sony 7506 is essentially a Harman Curve headphone, or pretty close to it.
Yep.
It's been a pick for 10 years. We don't have, readers hating us for it. We don't have people getting on there to say those things suck. Look, we can always find somebody that doesn't like anything, right? For whatever reason, maybe they just don't like Sony, right? We also have another article. It's by a guy named Josh Mound. It's on audiophilestyle.com. And it says, let 1,000 frequency responses bloom. And Dennis, since you pitched this article to us, what's the sort of central take of this article?
Well, the most interesting thing about the article is, to me, not the central take. The most interesting thing about it is that I actually found this article because Dr. Sean Olive posted it. So Sean actually said, that the writer put a lot of thought into why a single headphone target curve should not be forced upon the industry. And he also critique of audio journalists who go beyond what he calls journalistic ethics. There are things I like about this article, and there are things that I don't like. In terms of the things that I do like, I think he's very effectively railing against what I would call scientism, which is, people making scientific sounding claims that aren't really backed by science. And I would describe it as an overabundance of confidence. Brent, offline, you and I have many, many times in the past said that the language of science is uncertainty, right? And there are, people, I would say, who are quote unquote lumped into the objectivist camp with regard to audio that I think take that too far. It's the science, so we're certain about it. Well, no. If you could say that, if you say this is science, so we're certain, then you don't understand science, right? And so I do like that this guy is sort of calling out, he will never name him, but he's calling out Amir from Audio Science Review. I wish he had the courage to say, Amir said this, but it's very sort of a reviewer said this, and then he'll link to it and you find it's Amir. But
like Amir would care anyway. I don't know him, but I've read a lot of him. I don't think he'd care at all.
But he's sort of railing against something that you and I have talked about before, where we talked about Audio Science Review's coverage of the Audeze LCD2, and they said, well, it's a failed product because it doesn't fit Harman target curve, right? And you're like, well, that's obviously crap because a lot of people buy the LCD2 and love it. And I think that's what this guy is talking about. But I think he too takes it too far. And I think he fails to really wrap his brain around why having a target curve for headphones that 64% of people prefer, 64% of men prefer, I think that's pretty substantial. So this article is just a giant source of frustration for me because there's so many good points and then so many failed, just like he just drops the ball completely, and it's too wordy and it's too long and he doesn't really get to his point. But there are some nuggets in here that I really, really like.
So I'll tell you one thing I didn't like, and that's one of the reasons that I think Lauren's input here is valuable, is that, it's a very sort of lazy thing that people can do to criticize science, is to say, well, the sample size wasn't large enough, right? Yeah. You can say that about any study that you don't like. I don't know that there's any evidence that we, if you do, I've done more blind tests than any other journalists, and that's not pounding my own chest here. It's just because so few of them bother to do it. And, and I've been doing it for 30 years, and you find you don't need even 50 people to find, generally what people prefer. And, if Harman could have done 1,000 participants or 1 million participants, and it wouldn't have varied a whole lot from what they got. People hear differently, but they don't hear that differently. And, and also, no one's going to die from buying a set of Harman Curve headphones. But I thought, but Lauren is another, if willingly or not, Lauren is another study of someone who, there's Lauren's tested almost 2,000 headphones. She's worked with innumerable outside listeners, and she has constant reader feedback. So to me, Lauren's opinion of the Harman curve is a lot more valuable than all these guys who just sit there in the isolated, listening to headphones and saying what they like and don't like.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, Lauren, do you think we could judge give a headphone a thumbs up or thumbs down based on whether or not it hits Harman curve?
Overall, no. I mean, as we mentioned before, it's not just about the curve. But what you can say is that being Harman curve won't necessarily be a hindrance to it being a good headphone. And there are some curves that would. There are some tunings that just would be too out there. And people, maybe there's a subset of people who like it, but it's not necessarily what is going to be easily popular. And I know the word popular comes as a loaded term, but we're talking about specifically what manufacturers are gearing towards. And that was what this article was about, was how too many companies are chasing this Harman curve thing. And the fact that they're doing it, even in itself, take me out of the equation, take reviewers out of the equation, they're going to pivot if it's not selling.
That's true.
Yeah.
And that's really what it comes down to, is if something doesn't sell, they change, and it happens fast. Especially with the fact that now we can do over-the-air, adjustments and stuff. There can be firmware updates that fix it.
Yeah.
And I have heard that happen where something comes out and I get the initial, iteration of it, and out of the box, it's whoa, that's a pretty broadly boosted bass you got there. And then they do a firmware update and it changes the initial tuning. And yes, you can deviate from there with, the EQs and stuff. But, it's not just about me. It's about consumer preference bears out in the marketplace.
Yeah, I got to say that you and I both worked at Sound and Vision back when the headphone boom was first starting to happen. And I measured a bunch of headphones way back then. And we both encountered hip-hop headphones, the ones that were voiced more or less according to the early Beats headphones.
Yep.
And kind of tried to copy that sound a little bit. And I used to call them 3-hump headphones because they had a... when you measure them, normally you have 2 humps, right? Well, you got a bass. Forget the bass for now, but you have 2 humps. You have a hump at 2K or 3K in the response, right? And you have another hump at 6K or 7K or something like that, right? But these would be 3-hump, and they'd have a hump at 1K. And then they'd have a hump at 4K and another hump at 7 or 8K. And they all sounded horrible. Not only were they usually way too bassy, but the voice character was really peculiar, right? And those headphones don't exist anymore, to my knowledge. I used to just constantly be getting this stream of headphones for Sound and Vision that were all voiced kind of like that, and they all sounded bad. It's like someone said, "Oh, Juvenile has a new headphone." I'd be like, "Okay, send it." And I know what I was going to get, right?
I can just imagine.
That doesn't exist.
I can just imagine.
That's gone. It failed.
I can just imagine Wiz Khalifa coming into a research lab going, no, man, you need more 3K, It's just
probably not.
No.
But, but that failed. To your point, Lauren, that failed in the marketplace.
Yeah.
Now Beats sold really well, but they sold because of the marketing, not because of the sound.
That was the point I was just about to make. I was going to say that people thought they were chasing the sound quality, and then they realized what they were actually chasing was the cool factor, which is way harder, honestly, to emulate. And what's interesting is it was constantly discussed by people that they were even people who bought Beats were look, I know they don't sound that great, but I kind of just like how they look. And I'm that's insane that you're saying this. But I mean, at least, there's the self-awareness aspect. And look, that's a valid reason to buy something. If you like how it looks and that's your highest priority, then you do you, man. That's cool. I like that. Sure. And I think that what was interesting too is that I remember during the midst of that time, I actually, because a lot of these were also marketed as air quotes DJ headphones, right? And I just happened to get pulled into an interview with Tiesto. And I'm like, okay, Tiesto, you are the DJ. Everyone, you are very successful. Do you want a huge bass response in your headphones? And he was like, no, I do not, because I want something that's closer to more balanced. And so I felt really good about that, because he was like, yeah, that doesn't give me any idea of what's coming out in the club, because I don't want to hear my own thing. I want to hear something that's closer to what the system is going to sound like. And I was like, there we go. Okay. See, now I can work with that. So I think that that's really what it comes down to is like, look, everyone has anatomical differences in their ears, which means it's going to change how they experience things. We're going to talk about things. There are also, psychological and physiological things that can cause people to be more sensitive to certain sounds. We're talking about like misophonia and people that have, audio processing issues. So there's a lot of different reasons why something might sound different to someone else or be experienced different to someone else. But, again, you have to kind of, if you're making a commercial enterprise, you either have to commit to a niche and say, this is who this is for and make it very clear, or you have to say, we're going to do the best we can to make the most amount of people happy. And that, I think, is where Harman Curve comes from. I mean, look, Harman is a commercial entity. They are trying to find out what appeals to the most amount of buyers. Mm-hmm. And I think had that not borne out, I think, Dr. Olive would probably not be doing as well as he is right now. So,
Lauren, you've done all of this testing with all of these listeners. You've tested a lot of headphones that resemble or follow the Harman target curve. Can you think of any headphones that are very closely follow that curve that your listeners have just rejected?
If it's happened, it's usually because of some other factor that isn't sound. Because, like we've talked about all the sound because that's what this is about in Audio Unleashed. But there's a lot more, unfortunately, with headphones that's a lot like clothes, where there are other aspects that you have to think about beyond just the material you're working with. There's the fit, and is it comfortable? Does it connect well? Does it, there's all these other things that can go wrong before you even get sound into the equation. And so sometimes there's stuff that maybe sounds great, but are supremely uncomfortable to wear, and you can't keep them on your head for more than a couple minutes. That happened. Actually, there's a thought I just had. AirPods Max, they sound great. And I had people that even said to me, they're like, oh, well, I know you don't recommend them, but I got them anyway. And then I was like, great, keep me posted on how you like them. I'd love to, just keep an ear on it. And then come back to me and they're like, I can't wear them all day. They just give me a headache. They're really heavy and it just gets really uncomfortable. And so that oftentimes happens too. It's not, there's a lot more into the headphone thing than just the sound. It's, speakers are, yes, you have aesthetics with speakers, but it's a little more egalitarian in the experience. With headphones, there's a lot of things that go into it that's beyond just sound quality.
Okay, so we should wrap this up. Lauren, thank you so much for coming on, and maybe we'll have you on again in the future. It's not a matter of whether we want you on, it's whether you have too many entanglements in the future, but we'll find out.
Oh, that sounds nefarious and also kind of mysterious. I like it.
It's all of the above and more. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks for having me, guys.
We'll be back.
Welcome back to Audio
Unleashed.
I'm Dennis.
I'm Brent.
Yeah, boy, that rolled off really quickly. That was a steep roll-off filter on that accent, man.
Yeah, I can change. Hey, man, I was born in Texas and kind of raised in the South, but I've lived most of my life elsewhere, so I can go effortlessly back and forth between Southern accent and non-Southern accent.
Nice. Yeah. Anyway, this episode we are talking about someone who most decidedly does not have a Southern accent. That's John Darko.
His podcast, and it was percent THD. Why is it misleading? So this was like catnip for me if I had been a cat. Because distortion has been a favorite topic of mine for decades. The guy who is on with him is one of his frequent sidekicks, Sir John Eben. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I think I am. Who does the sixmoons.com website. Sir John, does sort of more technical-ish commentary on there sometimes. And he starts out, and I found myself agreeing a lot with him. And, when you say total harmonic distortion, that can mean a lot of different things. And as someone who does CTA 2010 measurements on subwoofers can tell you, when you do that measurement, you see which distortion harmonics are coming up, right? Mm-hmm. And you can hear it while you're doing the subwoofer measurement.
Can we pause real quick? I want to interject something real quick because you brought it. When you mentioned CTA 2010, the first thing I thought of, I think visually. So an image popped up for Roomy Q Wizard with the CTA 2010 graphs, and I'm looking at lines, and at certain frequencies there are certain thresholds for total harmonic distortion, and as they go up, those thresholds go down.
Right.
But I don't remember the numbers. I know the frequencies. Everybody knows the frequencies for CTA 2010. But what are the threshold the distortion thresholds at each different frequency?
I think we should rewind even further and talk about harmonic distortion means when you're somehow clipping the level of the audio signal. In other words, it can't go to the kind of peaks that it wants to go to. It can't go to 2 volts or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And or the speaker driver can't go as far out as it wants to.
Yeah.
And it's called clipping. It's when the speaker driver gets, to the limits of its excursion, or when the amplifier gets to the limits that its power rails can deliver, and it clips off the top of the waveform. Okay. And this results in harmonic distortion. So it creates false harmonics, which means if you have a 100 hertz tone, you'll get distortion harmonics at 200 hertz, which is called the second harmonic, 300 hertz, which is called the third harmonic, 400 hertz, et cetera, on up the road, right?
And each of those peaks is lower than the fundamental. Oftentimes, most times.
Not always.
No, you're correct. Not always, but
I have measured one subwoofer where, you got it down to like 20, 25 hertz, and the like second and third harmonics were higher in level than the fundamental, which is the manufacturer actually apologized for sending it to me. He's like, I had no idea they were going to send it to you.
Yeah.
And then you hear this as a change in the audio signal. And it can actually be pleasant in ways because, adding a second harmonic that's an octave above at 100 to 200 hertz kind of thickens out the sound a little bit, right?
Saturation. Yeah.
The next harmonic is going to be the third harmonic, but that's going to be not at an even number, right? So it's 100 to 300. 100 to 400, well, that's 2 octaves above. That'll also enrich it. And this is what Sir John is talking about. And you were going to say, what are the, can we get to the thresholds in a little bit?
Sure, let's get to the thresholds, but I wanted to interject one more thing before we get there, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So my dear wife, who listens to this podcast with glazed over eyes a lot of times, often asks me to explain the difference between distortion and noise. So I thought for the normies in the audience, it might be worth really quick, just in a few seconds, explaining that basically noise is a background intrusion on the signal that isn't really necessarily related to the signal. Distortion is a modification of the signal itself.
That's the best way to put it. So Sir John is saying, and you might start to think that the level of the different harmonics might be different with different products, right? And this is the truth. It is. Like single-ended tube amps have a lot of even order harmonic distortion. Second harmonic, fourth harmonic, and it sounds good. It thickens the sound in small doses, right? And there are actually amp manufacturers that intentionally add a little bit of that, right? Once you get into the fifth harmonic, you start to get into stuff that sounds, and even the third harmonic is a very slightly out of tune fifth. So it's an octave and a fifth above the fundamental, right? And when you think about a fifth, well, that's like when you have a power chord with a guitar, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Smoke on the Water.
Yeah.
Dun, dun, dun. That's fifths, right?
Right.
The fifth's actually below the fundamental in that case, but that's the way Ritchie Blackmore played it.
Yeah.
But that's what fifths sound like. They still sound pretty good. They sound kind of kick-ass, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's only a slightly out of tune fifth to where you don't, the guitar that's playing that might be that much out of tune anyway, right?
Yeah.
So once you start to get to the fifth harmonic, that is, as Sir John puts it, and he's getting his information from Nelson Pass, a well-known amp designer. The fifth harmonic, he's saying, is 2 octaves and a third above the fundamental. And the third, of course, is one of the notes in a major chord, right? In a major chord,
Mm-hmm.
not minor. And we'll get into that. And he's saying, so therefore it sounds consonant. The core point he's making here is these harmonics sound different, and the mix of the harmonics can make the product sound different. So just saying 0.5% THD or something like that, right?
Mm.
He's saying that doesn't really tell you what it sounds like, because an amplifier might have higher levels of higher harmonics that are not as consonant with the fundamental.
Mm.
He's saying that a basic just THD measurement doesn't tell you the whole story, and that people should be doing measurements that show what the mix of harmonics is, right?
Mm.
So if you had a product that had a colossal amount of second order distortion, it really wouldn't be a big deal.
Mm.
To get to your point before, at CTA 2010 subwoofer output measurements, the threshold for the second harmonic, which you'll remember is 1 octave above,
Mm-hmm.
is minus 10 dB.
Yeah.
Which is a very forgiving threshold, because that harmonic doesn't bother you. You don't really notice it. It sounds fine, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the threshold for the third and fourth harmonics is minus 20 dB.
Mm-hmm.
And then for if I remember this correctly, the fifth, sixth, and seventh is like minus 30 dB. Something like that. You know what? Look up Brent Butterworth CTA 2010 and you'll find my papers about. I've written all about this before. I don't need to go into it here. But yeah, so what happens is the higher the order of the harmonics, the more audible they are, and also the higher in frequency they are too.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about bass distortion, if you have extra energy at 200 hertz, it's not as audible as extra energy at 2000 hertz, right? Which is readily audible to us because that's where our ears are the most sensitive.
Yeah.
However, so he's saying that people should do that in their distortion measurements. And you know what? I should be doing that. I don't publish a lot of these measurements now,
Mm-hmm.
but I used to measure headphone amps for Soundstage. It's like, I should have done that. But I got to point out, Soundstage does it.
Yep.
They'll usually show, they'll show like a 1 kilohertz tone, and they'll push the thing to the maximum power or something like that, and they'll show you the distortion harmonics.
Yeah.
And John Atkinson's done it in stereophile for, a couple decades, I guess. So people are showing this. And I remember John Atkinson, since he measures so many crappy tube amps.
Yeah.
I got to say, he encounters this a lot, and he'll point out, hey, you know what? This thing has a lot of second and third order distortion, but that's not so bad because those aren't so audible. But I wanted to point out something. Sir John is saying that the fifth harmonic, which is supposedly a major third above, is not objectionable.
Mm. And
I want to say that it can be objectionable, and I want to demonstrate that. May I demonstrate this right now?
Oh, yeah. Fun.
It's supposedly 2 octaves and a third above it, but it's a major third. What if you're in a minor key?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, hang on. I have my hand to ukulele.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a G major chord. Here's a G minor chord.
Mm. Yeah.
Big difference, right? So all of a sudden you're adding a major harmonic over a minor key.
Yeah.
It's going to not sound good, okay? So fifth harmonic is not benign. Anyway, but he keeps kind of going on, and this is where it started to really lose me. He says a lot of things that are just wrong. He's talking about like super high order, odd order distortion, like, 11th, 13th, 15th order.
Yeah.
I went and actually looked at Stereophile and found like the worst amp I could find on there that was recently reviewed, which nothing against this company. It was a Zesto audio amp. It's a wacky tube amp, right?
Right.
You don't expect it to measure too good, but even by those standards, it didn't measure too good. even by those standards, when you look at John Atkinson's distortion measurements on it, they were still way, way down below audible level, right? They were like, 100 dB below full scale, right?
Yeah.
If you're looking at like 100 dB sound, which is as loud as most people play their stereo, the noise floor of a really good room is going to be 30 dB. It's probably going to be more like 40 or 50 dB.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is so far below the noise floor. Even on an amp like this, on a solid state amp, it's going to be inaudible. Even if you're pushing the amp to the limit, it's going to be dominated by second, third, fourth harmonics, fifth maybe. And these odd order harmonics that are way up there are also going to be so high in pitch.
Yeah.
That they're going to be out of the sweet spot of your ear. They're going to be at, 19 kilohertz or something, which you can barely hear anyway. And like minus 100 dB, worst case at 19 kilohertz or something, is just not audible, and it's not going to create an audible difference in amplifiers, okay?
Yeah.
This is just wrong. And he's implying that like solid state amps and Class D amps in particular have all this super high order, odd order distortion. It's like, you know what? Prove it to me. Show me the spectrum analysis of the amp pushed into clipping. And then he gets into, this is what really upset me. He's saying, and I guess Nelson Pass told him this. Nelson Pass, please, jump on here if he's misrepresenting what you said. But this is what he said you said.
Yeah.
Is that once you have high amounts of feedback, manufacturers have to add all these extra gain stages because the feedback is basically a cancellation thing, right? So the feedback, well, I'll tell you what feedback is, right? You take the output of the amplifier, which is going to be, typically inverted in phase from the input, right? You feed it back into the input. And so anything that doesn't match between the input signal and the output signal gets canceled out, which means distortion, right? So the distortion's canceled out to a certain point, right? At a certain point, you're pushing the amp too hard and you're going to get measurable distortion, right? But feedback cancels distortion. So, the more feedback you have, the more gain you need. But he's saying you have to add extra gain stages to compensate for all that feedback. I've never seen an amp that had this. I'm not saying there wasn't one.
Where would that happen? Is it every step of the way, or?
Okay, so the gain stage is the middle stage of a typical Class AB or even a Class A amp with a typical solid state amp, right? The gain stage is the voltage gain stage, that's the middle stage. It's a real simple stage. It's usually just one transistor, right? It could be a single transistor. It could be a Darlington transistor, which is two transistors kind of married in the same package for extra gain. But I've never seen one that had multiple gain stages in the voltage gain stage. And I'm not saying there isn't one. There probably is. I mean, how many thousands of amp designs have there been out there? But I've never seen one. Right. And if you look at the amp design books out there, I'll confess I did not go through all 3 amp design books I have, but I've not seen this. And then they're saying that these gain stages add distortion, except that's what the feedback cancels out. Yeah. This doesn't make any sense to me. And I've seen occasionally high-end manufacturers kind of blow smoke up the butts of reviewers with statements like this.
Or pander.
Because they know the reviewers don't really understand all this stuff, right? And a few of them do. But, we get back into the same old thing of like, if one thing sounds so much better, where are the listening tests that prove it? And I don't mean some idiot sitting around in his underwear casually comparing 2 amps. I mean scientific tests, match levels, blind conditions. Tell us how you did the test.
Yeah.
Don't just say, I did it carefully. Overall, I've heard, over the course of my career, I've heard a lot of people theorize that yes, all these differences in amplifier sound are due to the distortion profile, which is what Sir John is kind of getting at.
Yeah.
Okay. So the core of his argument is correct. But everything I said about how the differences in amp sound are due to different distortion profiles, everything about that is wrong. Because first of all, you'd have to establish that there are repeatably identifiable differences in amp sound, which still we're waiting on that. And plus, who pushes a solid state amp into clipping? A good solid state amp, something that's like a good solid 50 watts or something, right? you're not going to be, unless you're using like super inefficient speakers, you're not going to be clipping your amp, and therefore you're not going to have audible levels of distortion.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like all of this is just a giant phantom menace. Now, look, I am the master of distortion because I review Bluetooth speakers. And with most of them, they set the limiter to where it'll distort a little bit if you push it to maximum volume, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of consumer amplifiers, it's just not really an issue.
Yeah.
It's just not something you encounter in normal use unless you have one of these flea watt single-ended triode amps that puts out 8 watts or something, and you're not using it with Klipschorns or some super efficient speaker. And if you hook that up to a set of ELACs or something, which are not super efficient speakers, you're going to hear distortion. But like nobody uses those amps except for a few esoteric audiophiles. Yeah. And they all cost, I shouldn't say all, almost all of them cost a fortune. And I don't, the people that are buying a $8,000 single-ended triode amp, they're on their own trip, man. Mm-hmm. I don't pretend that anything I say about audio pertains to them whatsoever.
Yeah. I think that's probably a pretty good spot to wrap it up. What do you think, man?
I think let's wrap it up. Who's doing this? Who are we? What are we doing?
Well, I'm Dennis, you're Brent. I'm recording this thing. You are editing it and mixing and mastering and all of that. And somebody's going to do some music, and it's going to be some combination of us.
Yeah.
I wanted to shout out again, say great thanks to Lauren for joining us this episode. It was an absolute pleasure to have her.
Indeed.
So,
yeah.
Shout out as always to our patrons. Thank you guys for helping us keep this thing viable, so we're not losing money on it. Very, very much appreciated. And
thank you.
And you know what? Thanks to the people who commented, even the ones that were critical of us, engagement of that sort helps us.
I'm going to say in podcasts and amplifiers, it's better to get some feedback than none.
Brilliant. All right, buddy. It's always wonderful talking to you. For most of you, we'll see you guys in a couple of weeks. But for patrons, stick around. We got one more coming for you.
All right.
Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end. If you liked what you heard and wish there'd been a little bit more of it, we got some good news for you.
Indeed, we do. If you check out patreon.com/Audio Unleashed, all one word, you can get new episodes a little earlier than everybody else.
And sometimes it's like a day or two early. Sometimes it's nearly a week. We never really know until we start editing.
But the big plus is that you get extended cuts of every episode. And usually that's going to mean a whole extra segment that's about maybe a geekier topic or something that's a little more personal to us or something that's just going to really appeal to the hardcore Audio Unleashed listener.
Yeah, what it boils down to is if you're somebody who would support Audio Unleashed on Patreon, we're going to make sure the bonuses to every episode are really aimed straight at your interests.
Yeah, and so if you want to hear these segments, you can subscribe to our Patreon for $3 a month, which is less than I spend every single day on my cup of coffee when I go to Starbucks to write my boring articles.
Yeah. One more time with that URL, that's patreon.com/Audio Unleashed.
Or Audio
Unleashed. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.